In June 2020, a company worth billions of euros made an announcement that should be impossible for a real business to make. It could not find 1.9 billion euros, not lost in a bad investment, not spent on a failed project, simply not there. For years, Wirecard had told the world that this money sat safely in trustee accounts at banks in Asia. It appeared on the balance sheet. It had been signed off by one of the largest auditing firms in the world. It was part of the story that had made Wirecard a symbol of German technological success, a member of the country's most prestigious stock index, valued at its peak at around 24 billion euros. Then the auditors asked a simple question, where is the cash? And could not get an answer. Within days, the company admitted the 1.9 billion euros most likely did not exist at all. The stock became very nearly worthless. The chief executive resigned and was arrested. The chief operating officer vanished and became one of Europe's most wanted fugitives. And Wirecard became the first company in the history of Germany's premier stock index to collapse into insolvency. This is the story of money that was never there, and of all the people who were supposed to notice and didn't. Wirecard was founded in 1999 in the suburbs of Munich as a payment processor, a company that handles the technical work of moving money when someone pays for something online. In its earliest days, its customers were largely in industries that mainstream banks were reluctant to serve. In 2002, as the company teetered near failure after the dot-com crash, an Austrian executive named Markus Braun injected capital and took over as chief executive. Under Braun, Wirecard reinvented itself as a modern financial technology company, a fintech, riding the enormous global shift toward digital and cashless payments. The story was seductive. As commerce moved online, a company that sat in the middle of digital payments could, in theory, grow explosively. And on paper, Wirecard did exactly that. Between 2015 and 2018, its reported sales and profits climbed rapidly, and its share price roughly quadrupled. Investors cheered. Analysts issued glowing ratings. By September 2018, Wirecard was admitted to the DAX, the index of Germany's 30 most important listed companies, a milestone that made it a national success story, a rare German tech champion able to stand alongside the country's industrial giants. There was even something unusual about how Wirecard had become a public company in the first place. Rather than going public through a conventional initial public offering, a process that brings intense scrutiny of a company's finances, Wirecard had entered the stock market by taking over the listing of a defunct call center business. Critics later noted that this route allowed it to become a listed company while sidestepping some of the rigorous examination a normal offering would have required. From very early on, the structure of Wirecard made outside verification harder than it should have been. At its peak in 2018, the market valued Wirecard at around 24 billion euros. It looked like the future of European finance. But there was a second story underneath the first, and it had been visible in fragments for a long time. Almost from the beginning, there were warnings. Questions about Wirecard's balance sheet were raised as early as 2008, but the most serious and sustained challenge came from journalism. Starting in 2015 and intensifying in 2019, the Financial Times published a series of investigations, known as the House of Wirecard, led by the journalist Dan McCrum. Drawing on whistleblower accounts and internal documents, the reporting pointed to a troubling possibility, that Wirecard's dazzling growth, particularly in its operations across Asia, was not what it appeared to be. The investigations suggested that sales and profits at some subsidiaries may have been fraudulently inflated. What happened next is one of the most revealing parts of the entire story. When confronted with these questions, Wirecard did not respond with transparency. Instead, the company and its defenders went on the attack. Wirecard hired law firms and public relations agencies. It framed the scrutiny as an assault by short sellers, investors betting against the stock, and by hostile journalists. And remarkably, much of the German financial establishment rallied to Wirecard's side. Some analysts remained overwhelmingly positive on the stock into early 2020. The financial regulator's response was perhaps the most striking of all. Rather than aggressively investigating the company at the center of the allegations, German authorities at one point banned short-selling in Wirecard's shares and scrutinized the people publishing critical reports for possible market manipulation. examining the messengers rather than the message. For a time, the people asking the hard questions were treated as the problem, and the company was defended as a national treasure. This is the crucial dynamic at the heart of the Wirecard scandal. The warnings existed in public for years. They were detailed, they were serious, and they came from credible sources. But the company's stature, its place in the DAX, its clean audits, its status as a German success story, functioned as a shield. Reputation drowned out evidence. Behind that shield sat the central question that would eventually bring everything down. Did the money actually exist? A huge portion of Wirecard's reported cash, eventually the figure at issue was 1.9 billion euros, was said to be held in escrow accounts managed by trustees at banks in Asia, including in the Philippines. For years, that arrangement was accepted. The cash was on the books. The auditors signed off. The shield finally cracked in 2019 and 2020, and the instrument that cracked it was an audit. Under mounting pressure from the Financial Times reporting, Wirecard hired the accounting firm KPMG to conduct a special, independent audit, meant to put the allegations to rest once and for all. Wirecard publicly suggested the review would clear it. It did not. In April 2020, KPMG announced that it had been unable to obtain sufficient documentation to address all of the allegations. It could not verify the majority of Wirecard's profits from 2016 to 2018. This was not exoneration. This was a professional firm saying, in effect, that it had not been given what it needed to confirm that these profits were real. Wirecard's shares fell sharply on the news. Then came the decisive blow, and it came from Wirecard's longtime auditor, Ernst Young. For roughly a decade, EY had audited Wirecard and signed off on its accounts. But in June 2020, preparing to certify the 2019 financial statements, EY could not confirm the existence of the 1.9 billion euros supposedly sitting in those Asian escrow accounts. According to the disclosures, EY had been presented with documents purporting to show the cash balances, and there were indications that a trustee had attempted to deceive the auditor with what were described as spurious balance confirmations. The significance of this cannot be overstated. For years, the reported existence of this cash had rested substantially on paperwork provided through third parties, rather than on the auditor directly confirming the money with the banks that were supposed to hold it. When that direct confirmation was finally sought in earnest, the foundation gave way. On June 18, 2020, Wirecard announced it could not publish its annual results because of these problems with the balance confirmations. The market understood immediately what that might mean, and the shares began to collapse. The following day, June 19th, Markus Braun resigned as chief executive. 3 days later, on June 22, 2020, Wirecard made the admission that ended the company. The 1.9 billion euros most likely did not exist. The escrow accounts, the trustee arrangements, the cash that had underpinned years of reported profits. The company now said the money probably had never been there at all. That same day, Braun was arrested. And Jan Marsalek, the chief operating officer, disappeared. Dismissed from the company as the scandal broke, Marsalek fled Germany before authorities could take him into custody. He has never been arrested. He remains a fugitive, wanted by German authorities and listed among Europe's most wanted. The collapse was total and astonishingly fast. In 2 days of trading, Wirecard's shares lost roughly 70% of their value. Within days, the stock was very nearly worthless, down some 98% from a price that, less than 2 years earlier, had made Wirecard one of the most valuable companies in Germany. A business worth around 24 billion euros at its peak was, in a matter of days, worth almost nothing. On June 25, 2020, Wirecard filed for insolvency. It was a historic failure, the first member of the DAX, Germany's premier stock index, ever to collapse in this way. The company that had symbolized German technological triumph now symbolized the opposite, a national embarrassment played out on a global stage. It owed billions of euros in debt, and the pieces of its business were eventually sold off. Its core European unit going to another banking group for a small fraction of what the whole company had once supposedly been worth. Thousands of employees lost their jobs. The damage spread far beyond Wirecard itself. Investors, from ordinary shareholders to large institutions, lost enormous sums. The Japanese conglomerate SoftBank, which had invested hundreds of millions of euros, was among those who suffered heavy losses and later moved to sue the auditor. Thousands of investors would eventually band together in legal actions seeking damages from Ernst Young, arguing that the auditor had certified financial statements it should have known were unreliable. The role of the auditor became one of the central controversies. Over years, EY had failed to independently verify the existence of the cash, accepting confirmations rather than performing the kind of direct, independent checks that could have exposed the problem far earlier. It is important to be precise about this. EY has not been accused of colluding in the fraud. The criticism, rather, is one of professional failure, of accepting answers without the rigorous, independent verification that is supposed to be the entire point of an audit. EY, for its part, has argued that it was itself deceived by sophisticated falsifications. The regulatory failure was just as glaring. The head of Germany's financial regulator, BaFin, ultimately described the Wirecard affair as a complete disaster, and the European Commission called for an investigation into whether the regulator had broken EU rules. Germany's parliament opened its own inquiry into how the government had failed to prevent the fraud. Then came the legal reckoning for the man at the top. Markus Braun was arrested, charged, and put on trial in Munich in what is widely described as the largest fraud case in Germany's post-war history. Prosecutors allege commercial gang fraud, breach of trust, and the falsification of the company's accounts. That trial opened in December 2022, and years later, it has still not produced a verdict. Braun denies every criminal charge. His defense argues that he too was a victim, deceived by others within the company, and points in particular toward the vanished Jan Marsalek. One judgment has landed. In a separate civil case, a Munich court ordered Braun and other former board members to pay damages to the company's insolvency administrator over an unsecured loan they had approved. But that is a civil matter, not a criminal one. The criminal question, whether the chief executive knew, remains, to this day, undecided by any court. Marsalek, still a fugitive, has never stood trial at all. The questions surrounding his role and the money remain unresolved. The Wirecard scandal is, on its surface, a story about missing money. But its deeper lessons are about verification, reputation, and the people who sound alarms. The first lesson is the most fundamental in all of finance. Cash must be verified independently, not simply accepted. The entire Wirecard story turned on 1.9 billion euros that was said to sit in escrow accounts. The single most important job of an auditor is to confirm, through direct and independent means, that such assets actually exist. For years, that verification did not happen adequately. When it finally did, when auditors genuinely tried to confirm the cash and could not, the company collapsed within days. The gap between a balance sheet that claims the money is there and an independent confirmation that it truly is there is the gap the entire fraud lived inside. The second lesson is that reputation can be the most effective disguise of all. Wirecard was protected not by clever accounting alone, but by its status. It was in the DAX. It had clean audits from a global firm. It was a source of national pride. That reputation caused investors, analysts, and even regulators to extend trust that had not been earned and to treat critics as enemies. The more respectable an institution appears, the more dangerous it becomes to assume that its appearance is proof of its substance. The third lesson is about the people who see it first and how they are treated. The Wirecard fraud was not exposed by the regulator whose job it was to catch it. It was exposed over years by journalists and short sellers, outsiders who studied the numbers and refused to be silenced, even as the company attacked them and authorities scrutinized them instead of the company. A financial system depends on its ability to listen to inconvenient voices. Wirecard is a case study in what happens when a society decides, for a while, to shoot the messenger and defend the accused. The fourth lesson is structural. The scandal exposed deep failures across an entire chain of oversight. The auditor, the regulator, and the market's own analysts all failed in different ways at the same time. No single safeguard is enough. Real protection comes from many independent checks that actually function, and Wirecard revealed how many of them can fail at once when a story is attractive enough and a company is celebrated enough. The final lesson is about time. Collapse took 4 days. Accountability has taken years and is not finished. The trial in Munich grinds on. One executive sits in a courtroom insisting he was deceived. Another has never been found, and the money has never been recovered because there was never any money to recover. In the end, Wirecard sold the world a vision of the financial future, built on a foundation that included money that was never there. The vision was real enough to reach a €24 billion valuation and a place among Germany's most important companies. The money was not. And when someone finally insisted on the oldest question in finance, show me the cash, there was no answer. A company can survive almost anything except the discovery that the assets it claimed were, in the end, an illusion. What makes Wirecard endure as a cautionary tale is how ordinary each individual failure was. An auditor accepted confirmations instead of independently checking. A regulator trusted a national champion and distrusted its critics. Analysts followed the crowd. Investors believed the index, the audit, and the story. None of these was a dramatic act of villainy on its own. Together, they allowed a company to claim nearly €2 billion it did not have for years. In plain view, that is the quiet warning of the case. Catastrophic fraud does not always require a criminal mastermind at every step. Sometimes it only requires that the ordinary safeguards, one after another, quietly decline to do the one thing they exist to do, to check. This video is for educational and informational purposes only. All information is sourced from publicly available documents, regulatory filings, and credentialed news organizations. Markus Braun's criminal trial in Munich has been underway since December 2022 and had not reached a verdict at the time this video was produced. He denies all criminal charges and attributes wrongdoing to others. A separate civil ruling ordered Braun and other former board members to pay damages over a loan decision. A civil ruling is not a criminal conviction. Jan Marsalek has never stood trial, and allegations concerning him are unproven. Ernst Young has not been accused of participating in the fraud and states that it was itself deceived. Source links are available in the description.